Hello, everybody. I am Susie Miller from the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. The following presentation is based on analysis that we undertook in 2022. This analysis arose because the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops selected to develop a code of practice for the following reasons: to showcase all of the good practices that grain farmers in Canada are undertaking to preserve our land, air, and water, to be able to demonstrate continuous improvement over time, and above all, to show that grain farmers care and they're doing something about it. We developed a code of practice, a draft, and engaged with grain farmers from across the country to get their reaction, both on the practices, the concept, and also how the code was developed. We received a tremendous amount of feedback on each of the practices, but more to the point, we had some fundamental questions asked of us. First question is it an issue in terms of showing sustainability? Where is it an issue? How is it an issue? What are the compelling reasons for us to take action across crops and across the country to undertake an initiative to show the sustainability of Canadian grain farmers? And second was, okay, we accept that sustainability is important and that showing that we're sustainable is important, but really, how is the code of practice going to help us? So we listened to you. We undertook analysis from the summer and fall of 2021. And what this presentation is a summary of the results that we found. There's a full paper available in English and French that you can find on the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops website at sustainablecrops.ca will get you there. And we encourage you to read the full paper, as this is just a summary. So in the following few minutes, I'm going to be presenting the summary of what we found. How does it matter to global markets, Canadian markets, governments in Canada, and contributions that a code could make in showing sustainability, and how could such a code work? The first part, we interviewed 25 formal interviews, key informants, and these were companies and organizations along the full supply chain and those that were experts. In addition, we utilized the information we got on the feedback from our consultation participants and the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops members. So what did we find? This is what we were told. In the global market situation, exporters are being asked for a range of information about how our crops are grown, whether it's cereals, oilseeds, or special crops. These questions vary according to who is asking them and for what purpose. They can be general claims, are you sustainably produced, to specific information or metrics or verifications. These questions don't come from all markets. They come mainly from European and North American customers. There's growing interest from Asian markets, but there's also a recognition that some markets, such as Africa and South America, likely will not be specifically interested in how the grain is produced. Their concern is about the quality of the grain only and the price. There is a concern among exporters that the absence of a common Canadian approach, these requests will continue to be fragmented by customer and by crop, and will be increasingly onerous to respond. They also cited that other countries, the other exporters have something to offer, and if they have something Canada does not, it could disadvantage our grain industry. Some said doing nothing isn't an option. They felt that external standards will be imposed if we are not able to show the sustainability of the product through a homegrown solution. So what's driving these questions from customers? It is large companies' sustainability commitments and actions, and they are under pressure by investors, whether they're shareholders, equity shareholders, or lenders. Many of the large companies, because their customers expect it, they want to use sustainability for competitive positioning and branding. There's individual customer requirements within transactions, but there's also positioning for the future. And we provided significant information on companies, individual company actions, but there'll be more of that in the presentations. So companies are expected to provide environmental and social governance reports as part of their annual reporting. In some countries, these companies are, if they're publicly traded, are actually required to provide a report. But it's about the consumer as well. The interest in climate change and sustainability has increased on a world scale, and they expect international brands to not only respond and contribute, but to actually take leadership. I'd like to talk a little bit about how greenhouse gas reduction targets within countries and with companies can have an impact on expectations on farm practices. As you know, most countries are establishing carbon reduction goals. Canada certainly has one. Individual companies are expected to contribute to those country goals, but are also positioning themselves from a branding perspective to meet or exceed what is happening in the world stage. These companies frequently use the science-based target initiatives. That's what SBTI is, which is a protocol for measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the scope. So scope 1, this is how they define it. Scope 1 covers direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. For example, a company like McDonald's, that would include their stores. And, if they own delivery trucks, etc. But it's what they can control, what they have direct ownership and control over. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions from whatever source of electricity, heating, cooling consumed by the reporting companies, so the use of fossil fuels, etc. Scope 3 includes all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain. So what does that mean for farmers? For food companies, whether it be a retailer or food service like McDonald's, or whether it is a manufacturer like General Mills, most of their greenhouse gas emissions are not in Scope 1 or Scope 2, they're in Scope 3. So it's critical for these companies to be able to work with farmers to understand the source of GHG emissions at the farm level and to work with them in order to reduce those emissions. So this is an example of grain users' commitments in terms of sustainability. As I indicated, there are more available in the full paper. They all have greenhouse gas reduction targets, but many have additional commitments. Mondelez, for example, who are manufacturers of Honey Maid, Oreo Ritz, Wheat Thins, etc., theirs is published is more general. So it is to So it is to continuously improve quantifiable goals. PepsiCo, sustainably source and regenerative practices. And they are working directly with producer groups to be able to determine how best to do this. General Mills, they're talking about emission reductions and advancing regenerative agriculture. And McCain's, which is sort of Canadian manufacturer of potatoes, but they do use a lot of grain products, such as canola oil, and also most potato farmers in Canada also grow grain. They're looking for a specific Scope 3 reduction. They're talking about implementing regenerative practices. And interestingly, they're removing palm oil from frying operations of their branded products. Now, why palm oil? Because there's international concern among consumers and climate activists that there's a lot of deforestation associated with the production of palm oil. Now, there has been a program in place for at least 12, 15 years called the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, but only 35 to 40% of the palm oil can meet those standards. So some companies and some countries like the EU have determined that it is better to phase out of palm oil rather than to try to struggle to obtain sustainably sourced. So what's going on in the rest of the world? As indicated earlier, sustainability is not a factor in all grain and grain product markets. They tend to be in the higher value markets. And so Canada's position vis-a-vis competitors in those markets will matter. So what's happening in the US? Many countries, as in Canada, are using field to market to source products. The US has established a soy sustainability protocol, very like the draft code of practice. The UK is included in here, not because they're a competitor, but they're a buyer. And as a country that has a system in place, two systems, red tractor and leaf, they are asking questions about whether or not Canada has anything comparable. Australia has two approaches. One is Grain Care Australia, which is focused on quality, and Sustainable Grain Australia, which is certification for all grain products. Brazil and Argentina, as well as Uruguay and India, are significant users of the Roundtable for Sustainable Soy, which has been in place for about 10 years. But in addition, Brazil, because of the rainforest issue, and they have a number of other sustainable, that is regional based, to identify that product is not produced on land that was cleared from rainforest. So what's happened in the Canadian market situation? Well, Canadian food service retailers have sustainability goals. We're not separate from the global market, but this will just give you an idea for those who work directly with Canadian consumers. Loblaws has a number of them, large focused on waste reduction and packaging. McDonald's, we talked about that. Aramark Foods, which is a company that provides food services to universities, institutions, institutional cafeterias, as well as retirement and care homes. They have a number of sustainable goals, and Federated Co-op has a number of as well, and they established a Grown with Purpose program in 2019 that works with farmers to make their operations as sustainable as possible. So in addition to talking about what Canadian companies that serve Canadians directly are doing. The next section talks about our analysis on public trust and why it matters. So this is not geared to a specific company or a particular product, but it is about understanding how consumers view farming in Canada and what the implications of those views could be. So interest in how farming is conducted is increasing, some say accelerating. As I said, it's not necessarily related to a specific product, but it's farming overall. Climate change is top of mind issue for Canadians when they are thinking about how food is produced. One result of this that we can see is the top reason that consumers are choosing plant-based products is related to sustainability. Farmers are trusted, but not necessarily how they farm. For those that stated opinion, they have a very high level of trust in farmers more than anybody. They trust farmers more than scientists, universities, governments, companies, etc. However, they don't necessarily trust farming techniques. For grain production, pesticides, pest control products are top of mind where Canadian consumers have questions. For example, in a 2020 study that was conducted by the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, which is a farm and industry supported organization that focuses on providing information on food production, 42% of those that they surveyed believe that more regulations are needed. And what do they feel more regulations are needed in? Pest control products is the top of the list. There is a variation across Canada. For example, a work that CropLife Canada conducted in 2021, they asked whether or not those that they surveyed, public opinion survey, was whether pest control products and pesticides were safe. In Saskatchewan and Manitoba, 42% said, we're not sure, they're not very or not at all safe, but 62% did in Quebec. It's not consistent across Canada, but what can happen in one region can have a significant impact across the country, either through government actions or company actions. So why does this matter? And this is an example of an excerpt from the Government of Saskatchewan Public Trust Strategy. They have invested resources because they feel that public trust allows producers access to the tools and technologies they need to be both environmentally and financially sustainable and competitive. Access to our own markets and international markets, and support science-based policy and decision-making. And the idea behind this is if the public trusts how farmers farm, then there's a reduction in pressure on governments to change what's available to those farmers. So how does it impact? There's a high government expectation of transparency. They prefer, whether it's the Government of Canada or provincial governments, prefer the industry manage the public trust industry issues rather than government undertake that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the government and the Guelph statement, which is the blueprint for the next policy framework. So what does all this mean? So showing that we're sustainable isn't currently impacting the majority grain exports, but the expectation is the importance of this will continue to grow and rapidly. As indicated, many exporters felt that there would be risk that we would be shut out of higher price markets, but there will be immediate pressure from food company buyers and governments as they push to meet their commitments to greenhouse gas reductions and other sustainability initiatives. We know from experience that a lack of public trust can be followed by heightened government regulations. And interestingly, the expectation among Canadians that everybody do their part for climate change. And if grain farmers aren't considered to be doing their part, or aren't, and that considered is based on available information, that there will be public pressure for regulations to make sure that that happens. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about governments and sustainability to provide some idea of pressures and responses. So yes, definitely international pressures and commitments are driving Canadian government and provincial governments policies on sustainability, whether it be the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, UN Sustainable Goals, United Nations Convention on Biodiversity. And the Canadian government wants to position agriculture as part of the solution. They believe that agriculture is part of the solution. And the expectation is that focus on sustainable development will not decrease. The pressure from international governments to adopt like practice goals rather than outcomes. I'll give you an example. The European Union Farm to Fork has established a very ambitious goal of reducing 30% fertilizer use. I think it's about 30–40% reduction in pest control products and an increase of 25% in organic land farmed organically. Where this comes out in the federal provincial arena is in the policy framework, the next one being, apologies, it should be 2023–2028. And I'm referring to the Guelph Statement, which is the blueprint for the policy framework. And that provides funding for the cost shared programs that federal, provincial, and territorial governments undertake for farmers. That includes business risk management. They all signed this, and in the full report, there is a link. And the opening statement is advancing sustainable agriculture and agri-food, that the next policy framework will reflect the principles of sustainable development to meet the needs of today, grow for tomorrow without compromising the need for future generations. It's the first time in 5 policy frameworks. The first one was 2000, it started in 2002, that this has been front and center. This is just an example of activities that they have listed in the Guelph Statement that they would undertake for climate change in the environment, including supporting beneficial management practices, accelerating technological adoption, reduce GHG emissions, protect and regenerate soil, water, and air quality, and improve biodiversity. So now I'm going to talk about information we found regarding the potential contribution of a code of practice to demonstrating sustainability. The first part of the presentation was a summary of the analysis on the need for demonstrating, the need and value for demonstrating that Canadian grain farmers follow sustainable practices. The second part of the presentation is more specific to an instrument, a code of practice, to be used to demonstrate that sustainability. This analysis is presented for the consideration of grain farmers because they asked this particular question. Before launching into the results that we found, just a definition of a code of practice. The Roundtable, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, selected that particular instrument, that particular characterization, because of experiences, good experiences that the animal industry had in Canada with implementing a voluntary code of practice for animal care. However, it could be a standard, it could be a protocol, it could be many things. So when talking about code of practice, it is really referring to any mechanism that outlines the types of practices that producers are committed to undertaking to support sustainability. So why was a code of practice selected? Well, first and foremost, an opportunity to highlight all the good practices that Canadian grape farmers have adopted and to show leadership that not only do they care about land, air, and water, but they're doing something about it. A second reason was to permit grain farmers to define sustainability according to science, so that the definition of sustainability is not necessarily wide open, but it's certainly various, and is to define sustainability on our terms, so that the goals, sustainability goals, can be balanced with cost and revenues and be reasonable, but also be flexible to cover all the various crops and to cover the full country. It will complement other actions, and most grain farmers in Canada are already following the practices that would be included in the code. And in 2018, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops developed the metrics platform, which is a tool for the Canadian grain system to provide data on where and how farmers follow sustainable practices, and also that it be voluntary. And we can use those survey data and other data that is available on the metrics platform, rather than asking farmers to enroll. So what do key informants say about the value of a code? Don't have anything at this point, so it's interesting to consider. Some marketers are already using the code concept, and there's a high interest in a number of markets, and customers sourcing from those countries that have assurance systems are asking, and they believe, these are the exporters, believe that a code could serve as a discussion point, and they are concerned and would like something to ensure that marketplace demands are correctly interpreted in the Canadian context. It's intended to be a whole farm approach, and so can be used to prevent fragmentation of questions and responses, as it covers the full range of crops, that it can serve as a baseline, and that definitely what food companies said, if it can be shown to reduce scope 3 emissions, we're all for it. But another point is it can show continuous improvement over time. So what were those in the Canadian markets? They believe a code can assist in efficient storytelling. Many of them have experience with telling the animal care story through the animal care codes, and would really like to develop the partnership between the retailers and the farmers. The perceptions are leading to decision on purchasing, and a code of practice supports transparency and can help correct misinformation and also demonstrate progress that's already being made. So what are the guidance? They did provide some advice. Now, we received an amazing amount of advice from those who provided feedback, farmers in the consultations, and the approaches are not inconsistent. They're saying the same thing: keep it simple. There's a number of systems out there that require third parties for collecting data from the farmer. So what they're suggesting is a farmer self-assessment based on a series of questions. Reduce the size of the code. The draft responsible grain voluntary code of practice had over 90 required practices. So focus on the ones that matter and use familiar mechanisms like a check at an elevator producer. One code for all users. They don't want to be used as a competitive difference. And to this end, what they're saying is there's likely no premiums to be offered for delivering grain produced to coal, but prices would be higher at the elevator if these premium markets were able to be accessed. That it would be used by all members of the supply chain as a baseline balance. It is, of course, of greatest value if most farmers were able to follow this and willing to follow this, but there needs to be a balance with credibility and practices that are meaningful and can meet international credibility. Looking for continuous improvement, which can be gradual, and there is a suggestion that targets may be something that we should consider. And last but not least is meaningful reporting, so that it's not just a point in time, but also how things are changing over time. There's a variation in what they feel would be the most valuable, but most indicated by using aggregated performance data, like, for example, 97% of grain farmers in Canada rotate crops. That was based on a 2018 survey. That would be sufficient to demonstrate that grain producers follow sustainable practices. So this is an example. We got a lot of feedback that the draft code of practice, the responsible grain, did not highlight the opportunity, did not take the opportunity to effectively highlight the practices that farmers have already taken and their impact. So this is an example for those who were able to participate in the consultations of how that could change. So, for example, we've taken a soil management module. This would be the introduction. It would talk about grain farmers recognize healthy soils are productive soils and have taken action. And this is a kind of by the numbers approach: 95% low, very low or low risk, 65% increase in soil organic carbon, 66% reduction in particulate matter. These are old numbers, but the new numbers are just as valid. And of course, it would be updated. So that's one way to show it. These are the results. The second one could be that practices that are leading to soil health. For example, Canadian grain farmers are world leaders in conservation tillage, and it basically shows that the red line, that no-till seeding or zero-till has increased steadily over time. That's only one measure, but it is one that could be used. So this is how the code could be presented, that grain farmers follow these practices to maintain and enhance soil health. It's shorter, to the point, and provides lots of flexibility. That, for example, take measures to reduce the risk of erosion, and doesn't define how to do it. In addition, where we had previously recommended practices, this is an identification of other management practices of excellence that are undertaken when suited to climate, soil type, and crops. Because these are not recommended in certain areas because it just wouldn't work. For example, if cover crops are very challenging when you don't harvest until after the ground is frozen, or you have limited moisture available. But this provides a list against which we can measure for those farms that where it is suited to their climate, soil type, and crops. So if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to contact me at execdir@sustainablecropsca. And thank you very much for listening today.